You did everything right. Top grades, perfect attendance, a diploma with honors. You played the game, followed the rules, raised your hand, stayed quiet when it mattered. You were told again and again that education was the key to success. The golden ticket, the great equalizer. But here you are, smart, disciplined, well-educated, and still broke. Meanwhile, the guy who barely scraped through high school just bought his second car. The class clown runs a business, and you're updating your resume for the 10th time this month. If education is the path out of poverty, why does it feel like it's leading in circles? It's the question nobody wants to ask. What if the system lied? What if education isn't broken, but functioning exactly as designed? Not to liberate, but to sort, to control, to promise just enough hope to keep people quiet. What if being smart in the classroom doesn't guarantee value in a world obsessed with capital, connections, and conformity? Today, let's unpack this contradiction. Let's question the myth of meritocracy, the logic of the ladder, and ask, what's the real currency in a world where being educated doesn't mean being free? The promise that never pays. Education is the key to success. It's written on classroom walls, repeated in every school assembly, etched into our cultural DNA. Work hard, study harder, and success will follow. It's a comforting idea. Neat, linear, moral. As if life were an equation. Intelligence plus effort equals reward. But what happens when you solve the equation and success doesn't show up? Let's talk about the promise. The one that said knowledge equals opportunity, that degrees open doors, that if you're smart enough, disciplined enough, you'll rise, no matter where you started. But for millions of graduates, that door never opened, or it led to a crowded hallway with more doors, each requiring more credentials, more unpaid internships, more quiet compliance. You can spot them everywhere. The overqualified barista, the broke graduate living at home, the adjunct professor working 3 jobs to survive. They played the game, they believed the myth, and now they're stuck in limbo, educated but economically invisible. So what went wrong? The answer is simple, but not polite. The system sold you a narrative it no longer honors. In an age where the job market is saturated, automation is rising, and wealth is hoarded at the top, being educated is no longer a guarantee of security. It's a nice to have, a maybe, a checkbox, but it's not power, and it's certainly not wealth, because the economy doesn't reward intelligence, it rewards position, connections, risk, ownership, luck. And in a world where capital breeds capital, education alone isn't enough. You can have the knowledge, but if you don't have the network, the inheritance, or the ability to work for free in your 20s, you're locked out of the club. Let's be brutally honest, some of the richest people didn't finish school. Some of the smartest people can't afford rent. The market doesn't ask for your GPA. It asks what you can extract, what you can exploit, what you can sell. And in that framework, raw intelligence is just background noise, unless you can translate it into capital. So why do we keep telling young people that education is the answer? Because it's useful. It keeps people striving. It makes inequality look like merit. If someone's poor, we say they didn't try hard enough. If someone's rich, we assume they're smarter. The myth of education as salvation protects the illusion of fairness. It blames individuals for structural failure, and it distracts us from asking better questions. Like, why do so many essential jobs pay so little? Why do teachers who train the next generation live paycheck to paycheck, while influencers, speculators, and hedge fund managers live like royalty? Why do we honor learning rhetorically, but punish those who try to live by its values? Here's a harsh truth. Being educated often teaches you to see the world more clearly. But that clarity comes with a price. You start noticing the hypocrisy, the exploitation, the facade. You realize the ladder you were climbing isn't leaning on the wall of opportunity. It's a wheel spinning endlessly just to keep the illusion alive. And yet, people still believe, because the alternative is terrifying. If education isn't the path to freedom, then what is? If being smart doesn't pay, what does? These questions don't have easy answers, but they need to be asked. Not just in activist spaces or intellectual circles, but in classrooms, in job interviews, around dinner tables. It's time we stop treating academic success as destiny. It's not. It's context. It gives you tools, but not guarantees. And it's time we stopped shaming the educated poor, as if they failed at something they were promised. They didn't fail. The promise did. Because the promise of education wasn't just about knowledge, it was about mobility, about escaping the constraints of birth, class, geography, about rewriting your story. But when the system hoards opportunity at the top, when wages stagnate and tuition rises and student debt becomes a life sentence, then education stops being a ladder. It becomes a treadmill. You're moving, you're sweating, but you're not going anywhere. So what now? Maybe it's time we shift the narrative. Stop selling education as a ticket to wealth. Start seeing it as a path to wisdom, to critical thinking, to collective awareness. Not as a transaction, but a transformation. Not as a way to climb the system, but to question it. Because once we let go of the fantasy that the smartest always succeed, we can finally start building a society where people succeed because they're human, because they contribute, because they care, because they're needed, not just because they got an A. And maybe, just maybe, we'll stop asking why smart people are broke and start asking why the system keeps rewarding something so much shallower than intelligence. Grades, grit, and the great delusion. Just work hard, that's what they say. As if grit is the great equalizer. As if determination can magically erase generations of inequality. As if waking up at 5 a.m. and memorizing the periodic table will somehow cancel out the fact that your landlord just raised the rent again. We're told that good grades are the golden currency of social mobility. But in reality, they often function more like consolation prizes in a rigged game. Let's talk about grades. Those neat little letters and numbers that promise to measure your intelligence, your work ethic, your potential. But what do they really measure? Often they reflect your ability to follow instructions, memorize facts, and sit still in environments that weren't built with you in mind. They reward order over originality, obedience over curiosity, and conformity over critique. But we're told to chase them anyway. Because grades, we're assured, are the stepping stones to scholarships, to good colleges, to better jobs. So we pour ourselves into the grind, flashcards, sleepless nights, tears behind textbooks, believing that if we can just endure long enough, the system will reward us. And sometimes it does. A scholarship, an internship, a degree. But too often, when the ceremony ends and the real world begins, something strange happens. The rewards don't show up. Or they do, but they're far smaller, slower, and more conditional than expected. You find yourself overqualified and underpaid, respected in theory but invisible in practice. And then comes the cruel twist. If you're struggling, it must be your fault, not the economy, not the exploitation, not the system that values connections over competence. No, it's you. Maybe you didn't network hard enough. Maybe you chose the wrong major. Maybe you just didn't grind enough. The same culture that told you to hustle now turns around and blames you for being tired. This is the great delusion, that effort always equals outcome, that if you just try hard enough, the world will give you what you deserve. It's a comforting story. It flatters our sense of control. But it falls apart the moment you look outside the classroom. Because the world doesn't distribute wealth based on effort. It distributes it based on systems, on who owns what, who knows whom, and who's allowed to bend the rules without consequences. Grit doesn't help much when the playing field is tilted, and it definitely doesn't matter when the game is being played behind closed doors. So what happens to those who bought into the story? They become disillusioned, burned out, or worse, ashamed. Ashamed that their straight-A report cards didn't turn into six-figure salaries. Ashamed that their work ethic hasn't translated into upward mobility. And that shame is powerful. It keeps people quiet. It prevents them from questioning the system because they think their struggle is personal, not political. And that's exactly how the system survives. Because as long as you're blaming yourself, you won't demand change. You won't ask why billion-dollar companies pay starvation wages. You won't ask why the richest nation on earth has teachers working 2 jobs. You won't ask why success still looks suspiciously like wealth inherited from the past, not earned through merit. Instead, you'll keep grinding, keep producing, keep hoping. You'll be the perfect citizen of a rigged economy, tired, compliant, and quietly disappointed. But what if we broke the illusion? What if we taught students that grades don't define them, and never did? What if we made it clear that grit is valuable but not a guarantee? That structural change, not personal hustle, is what makes success equitable? That a system that blames the poor for their poverty while rewarding the rich for their luck isn't a meritocracy, it's a masquerade. Let's redefine what counts. Let's honor emotional intelligence, creativity, resilience, the kind that doesn't fit neatly into a report card. Let's create spaces where students can explore without fear of failure, where risk is rewarded, and where learning isn't about ranking, but about meaning. Let's remind people that success isn't always linear, and that failure is often a better teacher than any textbook. And most of all, let's teach that the goal of education isn't to escape poverty by mimicking power, but to understand power, question it, and imagine something better. Because grades might measure your memory, but they don't measure your mind, and grit might carry you through the storm, but it shouldn't be the only thing keeping you afloat. The economics of obedience. Let's cut to the chase. School isn't just about learning, it's about learning to obey. From the first bell to the last exam, the system doesn't just teach facts, it teaches behaviors. Sit down, raise your hand, don't question the rules, memorize, repeat, forget, do it again. We call it education, but it often looks a lot more like training. Training for a world that rewards compliance far more than creativity. You're not just being prepared for a job, you're being prepared for a role, a predictable, manageable, replaceable unit in an economic machine. The modern education system isn't broken, it's functioning exactly as a system built to produce obedient workers should. And obedience, that's not just encouraged, it's monetized. Let's break it down. From a young age, students are conditioned to follow external rewards and punishments. Gold stars, GPA rankings, red marks, standardized tests. The message is clear. Your value is determined by how well you meet someone else's expectations. You don't ask why the rules exist, you just follow them. Questioning too much gets you labeled as disruptive. Independent thought is praised only when it fits the rubric. This isn't an accident, it's a design. Because when you graduate, the world expects the same from you. Show up on time, don't talk back, complete the task, even if it makes no sense. Smile through the stress. Be professional, which often just means don't be too human. The perfect employee is not the one who innovates, it's the one who adapts silently, who produces without protest, who doesn't make waves. And the more educated you are, the more likely you are to be filtered through this mold. Think about it. The people with the highest degrees are often the ones who've spent the longest time learning how to meet expectations. They know how to navigate systems, check boxes, play politics. They're masters of performance, and that makes them incredibly useful to systems that require quiet efficiency, but not necessarily vision. Now ask yourself, who benefits from this? Certainly not the student crushed under the weight of student debt, juggling 3 jobs. Not the teacher forced to teach to a test instead of exploring real-world questions. Not the communities where schools have become pipelines. Not to opportunity, but to low-wage labor. No, the real beneficiaries are those at the top, corporations, institutions, economic elites, who rely on a steady flow of trained workers who know how to grind but not how to challenge. Obedient labor fuels profit. And educated obedience, that's gold. You see, education was once a radical idea. To learn was to liberate, to question, to resist. But somewhere along the way, that fire got domesticated, tamed, packaged into modules and GPA scales. Today, education is often less about awakening minds and more about aligning them with market needs. This is what I call the economics of obedience. A system where knowledge is selectively rewarded, not based on how transformative it is, but on how useful it is to existing power structures. Learn to code, you're employable. Learn philosophy, good luck. Learn how to organize your community, resist injustice, change the system. That's not even on the curriculum. Because obedience doesn't just serve the job market, it protects the system from critique. A population taught to accept authority in the classroom is less likely to challenge it in the workplace, in courtrooms, in ballot boxes. The more we internalize the idea that success comes from playing the game, the less likely we are to question who made the rules, or why the game looks the same decade after decade. And that's the genius of it all. The system doesn't need to suppress dissent if it can train you to suppress yourself. To believe that struggling is your own fault, that unemployment is a personal failure, that economic inequality is just the real world. But let's be honest, When you look around, the real world isn't real. It's rigged. It's an economy designed not for fairness, but for control. And the more obedient we become, the more stable the illusion remains. So where does that leave the so-called smart students? Often right in the center of the trap, polished, articulate, anxious. So good at playing the game that they forgot to ask whether the game is worth playing. So trained in being correct that they fear being bold. So used to chasing approval that they struggle to hear their own inner voice. And that's the quiet tragedy. Education could be a rebellion. It could be where you learn to speak truth to power, but instead, it becomes a soft cage, decorated with honor rolls and diplomas, locked with debt, soundproofed with silence. But it doesn't have to stay that way. What if education were reimagined, not as a pipeline to obedient labor, but as a space for radical awakening? What if we taught students to think, not just perform, to challenge, not just achieve? What if we measured success not by income, but by impact, by integrity, by the questions students dared to ask? That would be dangerous. That would be real education. And real education doesn't produce obedient workers. It produces free people, smart enough to see, trained enough to stay silent. There's a strange irony in education. The smarter you become, the more you notice the cracks in the system. But the deeper your training, the more you're conditioned not to speak about them. You begin to see the inequality, the contradictions, the quiet exploitation, and yet you keep quiet. Why? Because the same system that gave you the tools to understand the world also taught you how to survive it, by staying in line. This is the paradox of the educated mind in a broken society. You're sharp enough to recognize manipulation, but polite enough to tolerate it. You're trained to write persuasive essays on injustice, but discouraged from making anyone too uncomfortable in real life. You can analyze the power structures, but never question the hand that signs your paycheck. Think about it. From middle school presentations to grad school dissertations, we're taught how to present ideas in ways that don't threaten the status quo. Academic language is often a form of camouflage, sophisticated enough to sound profound, but neutral enough to remain harmless. We learn to critique systems in theory while quietly participating in them in practice. And it's not just about fear, it's about habit. Years of schooling train us to seek approval, to ask, will this be graded, instead of, is this true? To wonder how something will look on a resume, not whether it's meaningful. So even when we want to speak up against injustice, corruption, inequality, we second-guess ourselves. We water down the message. We tell the truth gently, if at all. Because somewhere inside us, a voice whispers, don't rock the boat. You've come too far. You've invested too much, and that's the point. The deeper you are in the system, the more degrees, the more debt, the more professional connections, the harder it is to walk away. The more you have to lose by being honest. So you stay silent, but the silence is loud. It's in the boardrooms where no one mentions race, gender, or class unless it's part of a quarterly strategy. It's in the classrooms where curriculum avoids anything too controversial. It's in the job interviews where you're told to be a team player, which often just means don't make things political. And here's the catch. The system doesn't need to censor you. It's trained you to censor yourself. Even among the so-called elite, the high-achieving, well-educated professionals, the pressure to conform is immense. Speak too boldly and you're labeled unprofessional. Ask too many questions and you're difficult. Push back against the way things are done, and suddenly you're not a cultural fit. So you stay in your lane. You learn to smile in meetings, to nod when you disagree, to express dissent only in private group chats, if at all. This is how systems protect themselves. Not by silencing ignorance, but by pacifying intelligence. But what if that changed? What if education wasn't just about producing articulate silence, but courageous speech? What if smart didn't mean cautious, but conscious? What if the goal wasn't to learn how to succeed in the system, but to ask if the system should even exist in its current form? Because being educated should mean being empowered, not just to get a job or write a grant, but to challenge injustice, to organize truthfully, to imagine alternatives. And yet the more you rise in traditional institutions, the more your knowledge is domesticated. The fire turns into a flicker. The rage gets rationalized. And still, you see it. You see the teacher who's brilliant but burnt out, stuck in a school that rewards silence. You see the student drowning in debt for a degree that won't pay off. You see the coworker too afraid to ask for a raise, the immigrant overqualified for a job they're never considered for, the neighbor working 2 jobs with no benefits. While LinkedIn is filled with curated success stories and inspirational lies, you see all of it. But what do? Because here's the truth that no diploma wants to admit. Education without courage changes nothing. Being smart isn't enough. Knowing better doesn't mean you'll do better, unless you're willing to break ranks, unless you're willing to risk your comfort to honor your conscience. That's the real test, not the standardized one you took in school, but the one you face every day. Will you name what you see? Will you challenge what you know is broken? Or will you just keep polishing your credentials while the world burns quietly behind the curtain? Because if the smartest people stay silent, then intelligence becomes irrelevant, even dangerous. Because silence, in the face of injustice, isn't neutral. It's complicity. So the next time you bite your tongue, ask yourself, am I being professional or just afraid? The real curriculum, what school really teaches. Ask anyone what school is for, and they'll likely say the same thing. To educate, to prepare kids for life, to teach math, science, reading, and maybe a bit of history if there's time. But what if that's just the visible syllabus? What if there's a hidden curriculum, one not written in textbooks or posted on classroom walls, that teaches something far more powerful and far more dangerous? Because underneath the algebra and spelling tests, school teaches you how to exist in a hierarchy, how to wait for permission, how to silence your instincts, how to measure your worth in numbers, grades, test scores, rankings. You learn not just what to think, but how to be a person who fits, who adapts, who succeeds by not questioning too much. This is the real curriculum, the social training ground where obedience is disguised as discipline, where silence is rewarded as respect, where fear of failure replaces love of learning. It doesn't teach you how to live, it teaches you how to behave. Let's break it down. You learn to arrive on time, to sit still, to speak only when called on. You learn that there is always someone watching, grading, evaluating, deciding your future. You learn that mistakes are bad, that curiosity is risky, and that your value is determined by how well you follow a rubric someone else wrote. You learn that knowledge comes from above, not from within, that there is a right answer, already decided, that questioning the framework of the question itself is not only unwelcomed, it's penalized. You're not trained to think critically about systems, you're trained to survive inside them. And then we wonder why adults feel powerless. We wonder why workers don't push back against exploitation, why citizens feel paralyzed in the face of injustice, why so many smart, thoughtful people retreat into anxiety instead of action. The answer is simple. They were trained to obey, to wait for instructions, to ask for permission before acting, even when something is obviously wrong. The school system doesn't just teach subjects, it teaches roles. Who gets to lead, who follows, who speaks, who listens, and most importantly, who decides. These aren't lessons you'll find in the syllabus, but they're absorbed deeply, through years of subtle signals, reinforced by routine, normalized by repetition. You learn to compete with your peers instead of collaborate, to compare constantly, to internalize hierarchy as natural. You don't just graduate with knowledge, you graduate with a mindset, one that often limits you more than it liberates. This isn't to say all teachers are villains or all schools are prisons. Most educators genuinely care. Many fight hard to nurture curiosity, creativity, and care in their students, but they're working within a system that wasn't designed to free minds. It was designed to manage them. Historically, mass public education wasn't created to produce thinkers. It was created to produce workers. Predictable, punctual, literate enough to operate machines, obedient enough not to question authority. The structure hasn't changed much. We just swapped factories for cubicles, bells for email alerts, and detention slips for performance improvement plans. But what if school could be more? What if we stripped away the hidden curriculum? What if we built education around liberation, not limitation, around discovery, not delivery? What if students learned how to listen to themselves before they learned how to follow? Because the truth is, learning doesn't have to feel like submission. It can feel like awakening. The classroom doesn't have to be a rehearsal for workplace conformity. It can be a laboratory for imagination, but only if we stop pretending that the current system is neutral. Only if we admit that what we really teach in school isn't just facts, but a way of being, a deeply constrained, deeply conditioned way of being. And that's the final twist. The reason so many smart, capable people feel stuck, confused, or resentful is because they were told they were free, but raised in a system that never taught them how to use that freedom. They were trained to succeed, but never taught how to define success on their own terms. So they drift, from school to university to the job market, carrying degrees but no direction, certifications but no clarity. They're fluent in systems but disconnected from self. And when they finally realize that the real world looks eerily like school, just more exhausting and expensive, they wonder what went wrong. What went wrong is simple. They mastered the visible curriculum, but never questioned the hidden one. So let's make it visible. Let's teach students not just how to solve equations, but how to solve for power. Let's teach history that includes resistance, economics that explains inequality, science that inspires awe, not just exams. Let's stop punishing mistakes and start honoring risk. Let's stop raising followers and start nurturing people who ask the one question every system dreads. Why? Because when enough people start asking why, the spell breaks. And when that happens, education is no longer a machine. It becomes a movement. They told you that education was the key, that if you worked hard, got good grades, followed the rules, and collected enough diplomas, the door would open. That poverty was a lack of effort, not opportunity. That intelligence was enough. But now you know the truth. The key fits a lock that was never on your door. You see the system clearly now, not as a ladder of merit, but as a machine of management. One that rewards obedience more than insight, one that trains compliance in the name of excellence, one that dresses up hierarchy as achievement and packages silence as professionalism. You were never broken. The promise was, but knowing that is power, because once you understand the hidden curriculum, you stop blaming yourself for not succeeding. You stop seeing your struggles as failure and start seeing them as friction between who you are and what the system expects you to be. And maybe, just maybe, you start imagining a different way. A way where education doesn't mean quiet desperation wrapped in prestige. A way where value isn't measured by income, but by integrity. Where curiosity matters more than conformity. Where being smart isn't about climbing systems, but dismantling the ones that don't serve us. Because you deserve more than a polished resume and quiet frustration. You deserve to be free. If this video helped you see something you've always felt but never said, share it. Share it with a friend still caught in the loop. Subscribe for more content that unpacks the systems we live in with clarity, critique, and a little sarcasm. And most importantly, question everything, especially what you were taught to take for granted. You're not here to fit in, you're here to wake up. Let's rewrite what education means, together.